And as far as Gary Moore, then, how many solo albums did he do during the 80s, we'll say?
He did an awful lot of them.
Yeah.
Jimmy, he did an awful lot of them. Basically, Gary Moore was one of these artists, I suppose, trying to make Gary Moore would deny that he was ever heavy metal.
Right.
But as far as I'm concerned, I don't care what anyone says. My opinion, there was a lot of metal in Gary Moore's repertoire back in the 80s. Like, for example, after 1978, he briefly formed a band called... Actually, in 1979, he joined Tin Lizzy again. Like, this was the third time. He briefly helped Tin Lizzy out on tour in 1977. He played in places like Melbourne, Australia. He was standing in for a guitar player, a Scottish fella, Brian Robertson, that was playing guitar with the fella Scott Gorham in Tin Lizzy. Brian Robertson had an injury. Gary Moore filled in for a while, so that was kind of like his second time. But then officially his third, at least his third time in the band was when he officially joined Tin Lizzy again, around later on in 1978, and Tin Lizzy came up with the brilliant album Black Rose, one of the greatest albums. There was the Lynette Moore composition, the title track itself, 7 minutes plus of pure heavy rock meets Irish traditional melody bliss, like, you know what I mean. On this track, a Lynette Moore composition they came up with, Lynette was playing homage to a lot of Irish legends. It could have been anyone from poets to Oscar Wilde, to the likes of Cú Chulainn, the hurler, to the Irish traditional melodies, like, we'll say, Danny Boy, Roisin Dove, the Mason's Apron, and Scott Gorham and Gary Moore, during the song, playing harmonies, would play the whole instrumental midsection, was dedicated to that, and it sounded so fucking good. You know what I mean? There was other catchy tunes on it. Gary Moore would have a kind of a crowd called G-Force around 1980. But basically, after Gary Moore would walk out on Tin Lizzy early in 1979, after the release of the album, he'd walk out in the early part of a US tour. Basically, it seemed Gary Moore was feeling that Lynette was taking too much of the credit for everything, like. So, I think it was a mixture of kind of personality and ego clashes between Moore and Lynette, that Moore walked out in a huff, and that was it, like, you know what I mean. After that, Moore probably decided, without a doubt, the only way forward, briefly, outside this thing around 1980, G-Force or whatever, but Moore would basically go solo after that, and the whole lot, like, you know. After that, it was a case of Gary Moore, ironically, would record a great album in 1981 called Dirty Fingers, which was, you could say, nearly, bare one track, his first entirely heavy metal album. You know what I mean? But he was signed to an independent label called Jet Records that was put together by a fella called Don Arden, Sharon Osbourne's father. Now, Don Arden, this fella now, Ozzy Osbourne was signed to the label as a solo artist as well. But Don Arden, he was a ruthless businessman, and without a doubt, if Ozzy Osbourne didn't get on with him, I don't think Gary Moore would either. Maybe Gary Moore was unhappy with the way this album was produced or something, but that record was never released, Dirty Fingers, at the time. And it really was a pity, because it was officially released by Jet Records 3 years later, in 1984. And Gary Moore disowned the album, even though there were some excellent songs. Moore still reluctant to be a lead singer. He brought in an American singer, a fella called Charlie Hunn, for that album. And there was excellent heavy metal songs on that. Hiroshima, nuclear attack, where they'd be going on anti-war statements and all that. Like, there was the catchy metal of really going to rock, kind of more melodic rock in places, but that was a great album. Even my brother Alan says that was a great one. When Gary Moore, when it eventually would be released officially, Jet Records, in June 1984, they'd release it. 3 years after it was recorded, Gary Moore says, them thieving bastards. Like, Gary Moore had gone from the label. He signed a record label with he signed a record label with a crowd called 10 Records. And after, we'll say, his official release in 1982 would be an album called Corridors of Power. That was an album that he'd have a fella called John Slowman in his band on vocals. On Corridors of Power, Gary Moore would sing some of the songs. This was a mixture of kind of heavy rock, heavy metal moments. Like, there was tracks like Rockin' and Rollin'. There was a heavy metal moment called End of the World, which featured the legendary Cream bassist vocalist Jack Bruce, him on vocals. John Slowman would sing Rockin' and Rollin', and then other tracks, Gary Moore would sing them. Like a hit single that he had in 1982, Gary Moore going more melodic American rock. He was delving into, Gary Moore could not only, as a guitar player, play in different styles, he could write successfully in different styles, you know. He could come up with a good blues song, a good jazz song, good jazz rock song, good blues rock song, good heavy metal, hard rock song, blah, blah, blah. He could come up with a good poppy kind of a rock song as well. Falling in Love with You, Gary Moore would sing that. The next single, another kind of American soft rock song, Always Gonna Love You. The second single from that, Gary Moore would sing that as well. It was significantly his next album after that, a brilliant album called Victims of the Future. Released in January 1984, it was recorded in 1983. That this was the first album where Gary Moore, well, the first, given that Gary Moore now, after Corridors of Power especially in 1982, Gary Moore was starting to get more commercially successful as well. Victims of the Future in January 1984 was the first time that Gary Moore would release a solo album when he was getting commercially successful, that he would sing all the songs on it. You know what I mean? Gary Moore, as he said himself, I had fellas in the past, Charlie Hawn, John Slowman, and I'd often be in the studio with them, he says. And I'd be often wondering, why don't they sing the thing the way I want them to sing it? And then he says that would lead me to saying to myself, why don't I sing it myself? Thus, all 8 songs on Victims of the Future, the whole album, he sang it himself. This, Gary Moore as well, given that he taught Corridors of Power, there was probably a little too much slow stuff on that. He went for the throat, more heavy metal, nearly all the way. 80% of Victims of the Future was heavy metal. Well, 6 tracks out of 8 were he melodic pop rock, a track called Hold On to Love, the first single, and then he had the beautiful ballad, Empty Rooms When We Love to Live Without Love. That was the second single, a kind of a hit for him in the summer of 1984. All the other tracks, Gary Moore proved in 1984 that he could hit the streets with anyone that was metal at the time. He came up with some brilliant riffs. He came up with some great songs. The title track, Victims of the Future itself, is pure bliss. He starts it off with a melancholy interview, and then it goes into this brilliant riff, you know what I mean? And then he leads on the melody and the vocals into the heavy part and the whole lot, like, you know what I mean? Victims of the Future was also an album where Gary Moore would also be even more recognised now than ever before as a pure, we'll say, a balance of, we'll say, guitarist, vocalist, songwriter, amalgamation of nearly all 3 in a way, but yet he could still do with the guitar hero thing. On Victims of the Future, He did it before on other albums, but nearly it was more evident on this one. If you heard some of the guitar solos he came up with, they were pure, unbelievable altogether. Speed, technicality, but also his own soul going into that. Blistering, loud, fast, everything. But the solos were all so catchy, kind of like there was meaning to him. It wasn't the case of just going blah, 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 and all that. He'd go, you know what I mean? He could, and you know the way he could just do it in a way that he could add melody. He could add a kind of like being the talented player he was. He could add melody to even melody and direction and structure, almost like a first part, middle eight, and an ending to a solo. Like a true guitar player, like a true guitar hero, no matter how fast you're playing, should be able to do, and Moore did that. Like, you know what I mean?